So today is just going to be a lesson on some of the basic techniques of rendering. So it will be in 3 chapters. It will really be the material, how to change materials, and how to use the ambient occlusion in order to kind of create that nice crisp white clay render for the weekend. We'll also go into lighting and just the different capabilities that Maya has, because it's quite a powerful renderer in creating some shadows and some other different material effects. And then we'll conclude with just a brief chapter on kind of bringing out a wireframe and an outline mesh for post-production, which Shay will take you through. So for the sake of this, we'll just create an object that we can add material to. So Shay and I came up with a very ingenious, interesting geometry. Interesting being a very, very loose term. And then we'll take this. So this is the geometry. Shay thought of it. It's a very, very, yeah, absolutely. And if you remember from the previous lesson, the way that we added materials was you would right-click on the material itself, and then you can go into Assign New Material, and you'd have a list of materials that you can kind of go through. But I'm actually going to introduce the Hypershade board, which if you go to the top, you'll see a blue sphere with a circle cut out. And if you click onto that, you'll find yourself in this menu here. And so this one here has an interface which along the top here you'll see all of the materials that are kind of preset in the boards, as well as the active ones that you add into the layer. If you look on the side toolbar here, you'll see all of the materials that Maya has, and the AI materials that are specifically within the Arnold renderer, which is where we will find our materials that we will use for this weekend. So you'll see that there's a huge range of AI light decay, or AI hair, and AI skin, which all have different ranges of kind of textures and tones and noise that are layered in order to kind of create these effects that might be useful later on for your projects. But for the sake of this one, we will click on the ambient occlusion layer. And you'll notice that once I clicked on that, there's a nice little shader ball that appears here, which will help us kind of interact and adjust it to make sure that the output for the render is the one that we want to use. And so you'll notice that in the top area here, the AI ambient occlusion has popped up. And if you right-click on that, you can see that there's an Assign Material to Selection. So I'm just going to make sure that my object is selected. And then I'll right-click on there, and I will assign it to this material. And so another way to kind of check, and if you have multiple objects in the scene, is if you right-click again, you'll see that along with Assign Material Selection, there's also Select Materials with Objects, and a couple of other options like refreshing the swatch. I guess it's the color swatch for the material. Yeah.
How do you put the hypershade?
Sorry. So if you look at the top toolbar here, you'll see several little icons. I'll go through these render ones here, but there's the blue sphere with the circle booleaned out of it. So you just click on that, and that will prompt this this window. And so I'm just going to, before I start manipulating the material, you might have noticed that there's almost like an interface down here that's very similar to kind of Grasshopper, where you see the widgets that are connected by a wire. Now, we're not going to get totally in depth and detail with this one here, but what it does is it just allows you to manipulate the material a little bit more in depth. There are drop-down menus here that you can play around with, the RGB. But for the sake of this weekend, we're going to go with the much more user-friendly breakdown that's very similar to the attribute editor to manipulate our material. And one of the things in the material viewer that you should definitely make sure is that instead of hardware, it's under the Arnold renderer. And you'll see that it already has a preset of the shader ball. But if you go through the different options, you'll see that there are other kind of geometries that it can apply the material to give you an idea if you are working with something that's a little bit more like has a rippled effect or a transparency to it. You can work with the materials in this platform, which will kind of give you a better idea of how it's going to turn out. And I'll bring it up to the cloth because it's a bit more interesting than the shader ball. You'll also see that there are the default for this guy here is off, but this kind of gives you an environmental component to when you're trying to determine how the material may look, which can be very useful later on when you start to work in more renders. I'm going to keep that off for now because there's no real context to this cylinder that I'm working with. And bless you. Also, you'll see that there are some shutter speed as well as exposure here. I'm just going to show you. This guy just kind of changes the background. If you have a darker image and you just want your material to pop out more as you try to alter it, you can kind of manipulate it through the exposure levels as well as the as this guy here, which I'm actually not entirely sure what he does. But anyways, we'll start getting into the ambient occlusion. So if you make sure that your material is selected, you'll see that there are attributes that are embedded within the material itself. The first one you'll see is the samples, which has a default at 3. Now, if you increase this one here, you'll see that there's a noise reduction and a slight blur that occurs within the projected shadow within the ambient occlusion material, and creates a more crisp image as you go up, and then a little bit more noise as you go down, depending on how you want your render output to look. Maybe a more textured or noise on the surface works for you, but I'm going to reduce it for mine. The spread also shows the way that the shadow and the shade is kind of spread out from the corner points. You guys remember from Matt's lecture that ambient occlusion doesn't really show light in real space. What it does is it takes two edges and it just creates a gradient of light to dark through kind of proximity to those edges. So in real life and in actual renderings, ambient occlusion doesn't exactly work, but it does kind of create a nice crisp image kind of out of reality in what we're working with right now. And the fall off, which is actually very sensitive, so you do have to be a little bit careful, just kind of determines how far the gradient goes before it basically stops. So if you start to push it too far, you'll see that it kind of washes out the shading, but just gives you a little bit of kind of dexterity or a few more options with the material itself. And then the near clip and far clip just kind of show how well, when it comes to these two, I think it's mainly just similar to the spread, just how far the shading is willing to go. Shay, do you know when it comes to the far clip, is it different from the spread itself? Because I found that when I've toggled with it in the past, it just emphasizes kind of the areas that are closest to the edges, and washes out if you start playing with the near clip.
It's like having like a region around like defining the extents.
Defining, yeah, exactly, kind of the domain of the of the shading. And then, of course, we all know opacity. And so if we start bringing that down, the material itself starts to become a little bit more transparent and shows off everything behind it. A fun one to look at, but I haven't found a practical use for it, is to invert the normals. And what that does is basically the interior faces are rendered out as light and the exterior ones are shaded when the render goes through. I'll see if I can find an example of that later, but it's almost like if you were to render the inverted or a polygon with a hole cut into it, it will lighten up the interior space rather than the exterior. And does anybody have any questions about these controls, or is everybody following so far on their computers?
I don't think we have the capacity for it, but it's definitely something that we have to do.
Are you working on a different? Oh, you're on. So 2018 doesn't have the transparency for ambient occlusion.
I mean, like, it's awesome with like just
Yeah, I'm just gonna double check this. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you have transparencies on other materials, like the basic AI default should allow you to have those transparencies, so you'd be able to create the material that way. I don't understand why it actually exists for the ambient occlusion, because that in itself implies a clay render, and I actually thought it was strange when I saw it here right now and started talking about it, but it's fun to play with opacities, so I couldn't help it. And are there any other questions about kind of this interface here, or are we we're good to go? Okay. So then this has been applied to this render here. I'll also kind of prepare myself for the next part, which is going to be a bit more.
Did you have to hit create first, or did you just exit? Get all those things applied?
Well, you were doing it in real time, so as you had the as you had the material, as you were operating on the material, it was updating what was going on the polygon, as long as you applied it to the material to begin with.
So what's the create one?
Sorry. So do you have your ambient occlusion on here?
Mm-hmm.
So if you,
like the bottom left hand of that window.
Yeah.
What is it? You don't have to do that. You just exit because it always does everything you need to understand.
That's right. So as long as you select, for example, this bottom plane, and you assign material to the selection, then any adjustments that you make to that material is then applied to the object itself. Okay. Is there anything else? Okay. So I'm just going to create a little shelf because I'm going to go into the rendering aspect of it. And if you look at the icons that are right next to the hypershade, you'll see that there's an open render view, render the current frame, the real-time render, and the display render settings. So I'm going to open up the render view, and when you click onto the little action icon, it will create the initial render for your object. So fortunately, it does take a few seconds on my machine. I'm hoping that you guys have an easier time. There's in the meantime, what I'll show you is the other icons here. So when you click on, for example, IPR, and you bring up the frame from there, as you change the materials and you manipulate the, for example, I can already tell from this that it's very washed out. But as I start to play with the material, kind of the embedded logics, I suppose, it will adjust in real time, which is super useful, but it's also very, very heavy for your CPU. So if you guys have a strong computer, then it's probably worthwhile to use that. So I'll, in the attributes editor, I will bring up the ambient occlusion. I can tell that the spread is a little bit too low, and I'll also bring back that far clip to kind of create a, I don't know why it's repeating itself now. Sorry guys. Just have to wait it out. But as you play around with these, you'll start to define those edges a little bit better, and it won't get quite so washed out at the top. So what I'll do is I'll bring back up my hypershade, bring back that, and I'll just play around with this until I get a more defined. Yeah, the fall off was just a bit too high, so that those shaded areas weren't quite showing up. And so hopefully that should solve that problem. Yeah, so that's a little bit better. We can actually see what's going on here. So I have this set up now to kind of get into some of the lighting aspects. Now, one thing that I've found with ambient occlusion is it doesn't quite respond with to the light quite as well as the other materials. So this next step is really separate from what you guys are going to be producing later on. Well, separate from what you're going to be producing for this Sunday, but later on it will be super useful. So I'm just going to apply a basic material onto these guys here. So I'll go into Arnold. I'll bring up my there's an AI, just a default that I'm looking for. I'll just go for the, yeah, go for Lambert. So I'll go for the, actually I'll go for the surface shader. So I'll apply that to the material here. Oh, I wish I could move this. Oh, it's not letting me. And let's see if I can just. Okay, so for the sake of this, I'm just going to do it my old-fashioned way, which is go into here, and I'll just select blend. And so I've got my blend material. I'll just play around with the color a little bit so that we've got something a little bit more interesting to play with. I'll up the specular color as well as some of the reflectivity so that we can get some glow, because this bit we're going to get into the lighting aspect or the lighting component. And initially with the with the lighting, you'll see if you go into the rendering tab, you'll see that you have a few different types of light to play around with. So if you click on, for example, the point light, in real time you'll see a little icon appear, which is this guy here, which you can move him around. And you'll also see in the, the attribute editor that point light now appears. And you can see that there's color, there's intensity, and a decay rate that initially come up with the attributes. Now, get a couple of these guys out. And you'll see that also type comes up. And in that drop-down menu, you can kind of go through the different types of light, so directional, area, as well as ambient lighting. We'll go through those in a second, but at the moment, what we'll do is we'll just see how this has affected the scene itself when we put up a render. And if the render keeps going this slow, I might just have to play around a little bit more with the settings at the end and then show you guys afterwards, because for whatever reason it's a lot slower this morning than last night. And so you can see two reflections from the point lights already appearing on the object itself. And so if you take the intensity and you start to bring that up, the amount of light reflected will start to reference that as well. The decay rate down here, right now it's on no decay, but in reality, light does have a quadratic decay rate, so over time it does kind of become less powerful as it leaves the source. And so if you select quadratic, then the light will kind of reflect that. And so there are a list of light effects that are down here. If you go into the Arnold renderer, you'll find the ones that are probably more useful for you, because it does deal with the decay type, the exposure, as well as casting shadows. And so it's taken note that we want a quadratic light source, so we can just increase that. And the cast shadows is on as well, and so we can potentially just increase those as well. And another important one, which is, sorry, jumping back a little bit, is the radius of the light as well. And so what that does is it really accentuates the kind of the half-life of the light source and how it interacts with the environment. So we'll just try another kind of render view. Let's see how that's changed. And so you can see that the intensity is already changed. There is a slight shading on the object below. The reason why there isn't a shadow cast is I've had a problem before where ambient occlusion seems to kind of ignore that. So I'll just go in and assign a blend on that one too. Does anybody have any questions so far while I'm waiting for the color or the wheel of death to let me proceed? Yeah? All right. Might actually just pause this recording in a couple of minutes in case, just so that you guys aren't sitting here or sitting and watching YouTube and waiting for the wheel to stop. So.